So something like the more nuanced view or perspective or claim that should be made in relation to, uh, with regard to the claim that apartheid has created problems in the present, is that then you have to concede that there are two distinct, separate descriptions of a historical cause of the problems that we have in the present. The one, you could say, is apartheid, and that historical cause already, you could, I think, reasonably claim should have been at least largely eclipsed by what is otherwise the second cause of the current uh, uh, d- dire situation, which is ANC rule and ANC policy and EFF style sabotage of ideological sabotage, and identity politics and moral corruption, which facilitates, so both. So if you want to say that apartheid is the cause of the present situation, then you have to say that there's another historical cause, which, because it is more proximate and because it is something that is still, because apartheid is something that is not in force politically. It cannot. How can you accord it political accountability? It has no representative except for this vile form of collective punishment which has been inculcated and is promulgated by war criminals in the making, like the Chief Justice. So, this politically correct idea that you can sort of cede all the responsibility into this cherry picked reduction of history, in which you're only essentially only white actors, historical actors, have a kind of perpetuated agency and a respected agency, and black actors are just passively reacting and passively part of the consequence of what has been set up, I mean, there's so much soft racism and vile inconsistent logic and reasoning just to maintain this disgusting narrative, and you have this political claim about the present circumstances being due to apartheid. You have that right as the second paragraph in something in the politically correct declaration that you have to assent to join the Democratic Alliance. You can't even join the Democratic Alliance without already effectively ceding all the political ground of that the ANC uses to continually facilitate its corruption. Because, I mean, once you have that scapegoat set up, reflexively, there's I mean, how much ground can you even make? I guess in some technical sense you can say, yeah, well, it was your job to fix the problems left behind by apartheid, caused by apartheid, and in you failing to be able to actually grapple with those things or make any real tangible progress, then you become the proximate cause of the problem, not the history. Not because the history was hard, it's because your policy is fundamentally flawed. But then also, unless it's been underlined as essentially, well, because of this moral corruption, which is identity politics, which has effectively, it hasn't been underlined in the political arena as because, I mean, up until recently the DA has been trying to uh, uh, make political ground on the same form of argument that is argued by the EFF. Um, so there's no distinction essentially in the ideological. You know, they just have sort of different. They all claim to almost have the same moral force. Only very recently, with John Steenhuisen, has there been some of a redirection of this, but it's still institutionally baked into the party. It's still somewhat in the constitution, the DA constitution, and in this anti-racist declaration. So Yeah, and I mean, well, I mean, I have no idea what goes on in terms of the DA. So, I mean, if people have already assented to this declaration, I wonder if, if they can even make any reform, any tangible reform, when they have a some kind of Senate and when things are potentially revised or can be potentially revised. But the people there themselves, I think, perhaps are, well, yeah, depending on the temperament and the intellectual sort of, I don't know, what is, are they going to be clued up enough? Have they had enough experience in culture, in sort of seeing the culture war and the toxicity of it, and the necessity of non-racialism, and making a clear distinction between this politically correct, anti-racist, uh, uh, convoluted, generalizing, instrumentalizing moral corruption, and a non-racialist vision, which is actually capable of having policy that is capable of maintaining an economy that is functional and works on a kind of meritocracy that is capable of actually developing authentic credentials instead of replacing fidelity and integrity and even dignity with this ideological identitarian identity consciousness that is meant to just sort of pave the way for you. And as long as you can just interpret something as being a slight against your identity, you don't even have to meet any kind of challenge or sort of make your way in the world. You don't have to do that because you can just claim that your identity has been infringed instead. And so essentially you create this currency of vulnerable narcissism, of covert narcissism, that can effectively just in bad faith interpret every kind of inconvenience as an identitarian provocation, and by just sort of projecting onto any kind of immediate environment this kind of ideological uh, 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 factionalism and token representation of groups, and people not willing to accept their collective punishment for history, and just because of their unwillingness to sort of take on that subservient valence that means that they need to be beaten into some kind of cultural and social um, submission until the ideology is pervasively bought into. And this was the take which you could say Musi Maimane uh, uh, what's the word um, tactically tried to advance in under the umbrella thereof. Um, what's the word that means opportunistic. That was the tact that Musi Maimane was opportunistically trying to say, oh, let me be the one to hold the uh, to govern the identities, to be the arbiter, to be the right paternalist, infantilizing all the individuals as they will be treated fairly according to their group designation. That he should be the one to wield that kind of statist, um, moral authoritarian kind of role, in this gambit of this very particular sick, what you could call political correctness, which then becomes a kind of estate and cultural uh, uh, parallel system, in which everything becomes an ideological piece of the same system. It's a very totalitarian. I mean, but also in terms of how it corrupts the law fundamentally. As soon as you justify being able to treat people as tokens according to group designation, I mean, it's just it's beyond irony. It's beyond satire in terms of what has been done to the constitution. The new South Africa, ideologically, ethically, must be regarded as already being dead. I mean, the only thing that remains of the new South Africa is merely window dressing. The question is, can it be resurrected? And it will only be resurrected with decisive and clear, visionary and very nuanced and calibrated points being made that amount to a polemic that will rebut and deflate uh, uh, the only polemic which exists at the moment in the political arena, which is essentially the EFF, which is why essentially businesses will never rally behind the DA, because the DA offers them no real cover. And in fact, they are probably, let's say, in their minds, they're sympathetic towards the DA, but they wouldn't dare um, essentially hurt the DA even more optically by getting behind them, because essentially they would just be confirming the theory and the accusation and the ideological complaints that come from the EFF style politics and identitarians, that the DA is the party of white monopoly capital, which they'll call the DA anyway. So how do the businesses deal with that when they're not being given any cover, when there is no direct confrontation with those malignments and those accusations and that ideological framing, when there is no direct deflation and debunking of those kinds of criticisms? And I mean, yes, the media itself is incredibly hostile. There is no way to get around that. Which, I mean, it must be used to the advantage. The idea that you're going to catch a break, people actually, the media might be forced to at some point start to reckon with your distinguishing or distinctive of polemic once you start establishing it and repeating it, and actually trying to vindicate it in particular skirmishes of ideological clashing in rhetoric and such. But that's only ever going to happen. In the beginning, it's going to be a hugely uphill battle, which essentially it already is. But because one is not actually forthrightly engaging in the uphill confrontation, it's impossible to gain ground, because you keep on sort of just trying to pretend that it's a level playing field in some ideological sense, instead of saying, uh, like, forthrightly dealing with the projections that are cast onto you and saying things that are slightly dangerous that half play into them, but then you actually distinguish your position from the low resolution generalization that is being projected onto you. So you challenge the thing that, for example, that apartheid is the cause of the current dire position that we're in. That you say that it is a historical cause, and there is another more proximate, relevant, pertinent historical cause: ANC rule, ANC policy, and this EFF style sabotage of the economy, and EFF style ideology and identity politics, which also, by the way, is another way of saying useful plutocratic propaganda that insulates a black elite, essentially, that can profit from the moral corruption that is called black empowerment, because we don't have disadvantage empowerment instead, because we don't have non-racialist disadvantage empowerment. So being able to say the politically incorrect thing is almost a necessity. It's almost, that is the first hurdle that has to be surmounted, that has to be, You have to give yourself permission to do that, and then the idea is to defend the new line in a nuanced way. That is how you distinguish yourself as a particular political platform. Now there is a problem because let's say there are a lot of vocal so-called liberals out there who are essentially, I think the best way to understand, let's say, this faux liberalism, or whatever you want to call it, is you just have to imagine that intellectual sympathy is a very dangerous thing. So once you have, even, it doesn't matter what you call yourself, so uh, you have someone who, let's say, they see the sense, supposedly the logic in libertarian logic, but then because of their intellectual sympathy, oh, well, we can just throw it all out the window, we can all just sort of turn it upside down, and we'll just suspend it for now. But at the end, at the other side, once we've gotten there, then we'll implement libertarian, sort of policy. That's their idea. So in some sense, they're libertarian, but not in terms of the special treatment that needs to happen in the meantime. They don't believe in libertarianism as a means to an end. They believe that it comes after certain prerequisites have been sort of, so we're in a special sort of condition, we're in a special sort of twilight zone in which somehow the government and centralized authority and ad hoc administration and very lax and loose policies that don't use the rule of law, that fudge things, which can be used obviously to helicopter drop money onto black elites instead of actually dealing with anything effectively and efficiently. We can just throw all efficiency and just practical anything out the window, because we're going to have a very happy political elite that get their narcissistic uh, sadistic program of retributivism and collective revenge that will feel so emotionally good and so emotionally empowering, um, that will be uh, that kind of that emotional logic is holistic enough, uh, that the details don't matter. Now, if you just try to sort of pretend that it's like a level playing field, that no, if you just say no, that doesn't work, but you don't say, it's not enough to say why it doesn't work in terms of your paradigm. You have to say why it doesn't work in terms of their own paradigm. You have to debunk it on the level of morality, not on the level of pragmatism. Yes, you can use the pragmatic argument as a second leg of a refutation. You can certainly do that. But trying to use it as the main leg, it's not going to work. You're not going to make any inroads. Again, you think that you're going to be able to count on a media that is going to sort of treat all these arguments and represent them in the media fairly. They're not going to do that. They're ideologically captured by the moral impulsion and coercion that is why, for example, the DA itself fell to this political correct scourge. Um, of being able to instrumentalize individuals and treat them as designated groups. I mean, it's, I mean, the level of I mean, so you can just look at the cultural, um, uh, the contraction of this moral evil has even gone far within the DA itself, within its recent history, and now suddenly, because the leadership has somewhat turned over, and some people are opening their eyes to, let's say, perhaps, hopefully, a burgeoning cultural novation, in hopefully towards a new epoch in which this scourge is properly identified. That seeing society and interpreting it in the same fascistic worldview as looking at factions of identity, and so the sociological reduction of the human, which is to essentially escape what social justice is actually means in the Constitution, and to interpret social justice to essentially mean that you're allowed to instrumentalize people. I mean, it is just, this is something that has even, at least in recent history, been embraced by the DA. The idea that suddenly the media landscape is going to give you an open level playing field. It's not going to happen, obviously. And the only way that you're going to be able to actually shock the system is to actually explicitly articulate the argument in terms of debunking their moral reasoning, not in terms of their practical outcomes. I mean, yes, we can look at the history of South Africa. All of their policy has essentially eviscerated growth. We have an anemic small and medium business sector. All black professionals that are, and I'm speaking generally, that are decent, they will leave this country, because why would you be treated like a token? Why would you put up with it? Why would you get into this disgusting economy of identitarian tokenism? It's undignified. I mean, if you're a competent professional, why would you have that sully your credentials? Why would you want to write it on your CV? No, just go work in London. Just go work somewhere else. And that's what they do. We have a tremendous brain drain in that way, because we have people that, let's say, are enlightened enough to know that uh, trying to be a prince in a hellscape, or be part of a meritocracy in a functioning economy that doesn't have this toxic displacement of actual credentials and credibility, where everything, um, which is what we have, where essentially all the trust in society has to just simply somehow just conform with this ideological filter. It's inhuman. I mean, so obviously it's just a manufacturing base of more identity consciousness, more toxic identity consciousness, and the DA has to a large extent um, allowed itself to collect this sentiment. And so the question is, I mean, I don't even know if the DA is capable of rebuffing this and reforming this and revising this. It might really have too many narcissistic individuals within its personnel that it's not actually capable, because for a vulnerable narcissist, identity politics is just much too convenient to give up, especially since it's had its day in the sun. It's been a cultural hegemon. Um, the idea that a vulnerable narcissist is going to be able to move into a space, into a different cultural space in which they no longer are allowed to just project in a way onto people in their environment, so that they will always have a narrative that they can depend on, that they will never have to feel unsure about themselves because they can just represent some identity interest and everything must conform and be subservient. Um, it's too enticing, that level of power. Um, you know, because you can always just interpret everything in terms of identity. It's an ulterior um, paradigm that you can just always step into, and so why would you ever step out of it? So people don't want to step out of it. They, I mean, it's a bad faith consciousness. It's what Nietzsche would have called slave morality, and these people are happy to try to sort of, I mean, it's a wonderful imagination to have, essentially, because you can always just imagine that, well, if it's actually implemented correctly and orchestrated properly, it's going to deliver lots and lots of nice things. It just, we haven't got the right leaders that are doing it right. We just need the right people with the right motivations. It's always got this sort of wishful thinking about itself. Um, and in the meantime, essentially, it just, uh, what's the word? Um, that means sort of guarantees, but it provides a kind of, I can't think of the right word, but it provides an assurance that that is that is that provides a kind of ideological certainty. The problem is that this ideological certainty has to be made up of something that's real, and because it's effectively a negative value in some sense, it's a complaint. It has to be made against something, and so it can only be proven to be real if you can actually extract some pain and damage from somebody else, if it actually gives you the right to actually disrupt somebody else's life, essentially. And so this is why it has this fundamentally cannibalistic tendency within it, essentially. It's a vampire. I mean, this is why the best way to understand it is if you understand and model vulnerable narcissism. That's exactly what it is. It's basically a political cult of vulnerable narcissism. And I mean, if anyone actually experiences it for long enough and they acclimatize themselves to it and they just sort of accept that, well, this is how politics is going to be played, this is going to be the gauntlet, this is going to be the particular I mean, it's a negative value, and so once you've sort of bought into it, it has a kind of systemic production in which you will invariably get a kind of totalitarian morality. You will invariably get a corruption of the law, and you will invariably get a kind of political coordinator class. Um, you will produce a kind of a weird sort of elite, a political executive that will sort of reign over what could never be described as a liberal democracy, could only be described as something democracy in name only, and the law that will essentially promulgate the culture itself and police the culture itself and keep the culture clean, uh, in facilitation of that disgusting ideology that gets entrenched as a kind of as an orthodoxy and a dogma. And vulnerable narcissists can always see themselves being as part of that elite, being as part of that intelligentsia. um, and these people will be present in the DA. Can't think that they won't be, and you will it will be painful perhaps to expunge them. You will have to you will have to try identify them, and they will be so toxic that if they stay around, they will only cause problems. The identity politics bug is a serious contagion. It's a serious virulent disease. It is a moral corruption, and it will always facilitate state corruption. Um, yeah, that's, I guess, the only kind of stuff. Yeah, so I mean, having having to deal with that, I okay, I guess I'm going to try and make this recording a displacement of another recording that I made. The DA itself has got bad rules, internal rules. They're not based on principle. A lot of them. Um, it's much easier when you use kind of superficial appearances, like when you say that you have brought the party into disrepute. That is a kind of, uh, if anything, that sort of endorses the media's interpretation of the party. It doesn't have an internal inbuilt, sort of ethical or principle based thing. It is much harder because, I mean, the courts themselves are pretty much captured to a large extent by identity politics ideology. It has become somewhat of the state, um, uh, the state's moral code, in which you interpret all the legislation and such. Or, I mean, it is in secondary legislation. At some, the Promotion of Equality Act is fundamentally unconstitutional, and it is a secondary constitutional, um, uh, it's raised above other pieces of legislation because it is it's secondary constitutional legislation, which is meant to directly sort of enact specific provisions in the Constitution. So yeah, that because and then essentially you're interpreting all other pieces of legislation through that secondary legislation, which is in a sense meant to stand in for the expression or the manifestation or the detail that supposedly the Constitution is implying. And yeah, so we've got a poisonous uh, source of this moral evil in that. Anyway, the slight tangent. Anyway, the problem with the DA's, so if you bring the DA's rules in, for example, where you bring the DA into disrepute, I mean, what I've just been talking about has been a strategy to create a very particular kind of controversy and a very particular kind of polemic. And so, in some sense, one has to, I think, say that the right kind of controversy is the right controversy as long as the party can consistently support the particular issue involved and the position and can sort of hold that line that the individual sort of expressed. And so I do think that there has to be a more rigorous description of principles and values and also how these things are arbitrated or internally, some kind of ethics panel or something like that in order to invigilate. And so perhaps, it would be better if there was some kind of investigative and also semi, I don't know, review board or something like that, which has perhaps even more far-reaching power than these blanket superficial rules of, but that also there needs to be something in which people can perhaps express their independent views in let's say in the specific defense, because I mean sometimes you're not able to give a forthright rebuttal to something unless you can speculate on things that are not, that the policy platform of the party on is currently mute on. And so one either needs to have a very, very sophisticated a party platform, which I think has to occur anyway, that deals with all of these issues, but also more importantly, there needs to be more leeway for members of parliament, for members of the party itself to be more reflexive in being able to engage authentically, but it's still being quite clearly within the framework that the party is a common core to the party. And so this will have to be based around principles and sort of principles that are higher than other principles and principles that are sort of that are, so I mean, it's the difference between just having a kind of a law code and having general principles of law which sort of are housed within a particular structure that has a cohesive self-consistency, um, that creates an ethos, that creates an actual ethos that is capable of, as I keep on saying, deflating and rebuffing identity politics and asserting non-racialism and the solutions of non-racialism, um, and also uh, the power of also liberal um, there's going to need to be perhaps a more delineated explanation and formulation of liberal thinking within the South African context, which has generally been left vague enough for it to sort of be transmuted into a kind of self-compromise into the arguments of political correctness and what has been called sometimes anti-racism. There's another good resource sort of on this, which is oh my word, I can't remember his name. Hugh um, Hugh Coleman, Coleman Hugh. He wrote. He's a student, but he wrote an article. He's sort of a journalist as well. Coleman Hughes, is that his name, or it's the other way around? And he's got a lecture on YouTube, which is something like I can't remember the name of the lecture, but it's something. It's got anti-racism in the name, but he's just distinguishing essentially between non-racialism and anti-racial, anti-racism. But he might. Oh no, he doesn't say non-racialism. He uses the word humanism. Yeah, so he distinguishes between the humanist worldview and the anti-racist worldview. That's sort of what his lecture is about. Um, and the question and answers in that lecture that he gave is certainly uh, very prescient. Anyway, okay, and let me just finish this point about DAs. Perhaps its internal mechanics. So there needs to be some kind of code phrase or code word in which a member can start to, let's say, even pontificate on certain points that are, let's say, fundamentally speculative on future policy, that are not inconsistent with current policy, and that are still consistent with certain principles and structures of values within the party. And without that kind of reflexive leeway, I really also don't see how there's going to be a genuine enough, authentic enough rhetorical exchange with opposing ideologies to be able to make fundamental ground, um, because it's not going to be easy to because I mean essentially you have the only way to reverse the projections and aspersions that are being thrown at the DA, which are all this sort of the political correctness buzzwords, um, is to sort of seemingly agree and disagree somewhat, uh, because whatever they say, whatever they accuse, it's always a strange generalization. It's always a conflation of things, and it's an oversimplification. And so, because it's an oversimplification, there is like an element of truth with it, but it's generalized in such a way that it's so intellectually dishonest and corrupt that it's just absolutely insane. And then always, because of that generalization, there is always a tremendous capacity of self-deception and facilitation of corruption and any kind of kleptocracy and shenanigans. And so the the skill is that you start to interpret these things because it's very formulaic. All the things that they throw at you are incredibly formulaic, and they're all based essentially on a kind of self-imposed ignorance to make the oversimplification work. And your job essentially is interpreting how that form of ignorance allows them to malign you, and then you kind of sort of half agree with them maligning you, and then you sort of ask the open question. I mean, this is one tact. I mean, but you can also satirically kind of accept them maligning you, and then you ask the open question. But then, how are you accounting for this? How are you going to negate that from happening? If we follow your method, it leads to these problems, and obviously it's not good to ask them open questions, but to put it in the form of first a claim and then a question. Well, if you're going to contradict the point that I just made, you have to be able to answer that question. And once you start sort of, I mean, it really depends on someone's particular temperament. People have different intellectual wavelengths, as it were. So you have to find an authentic, comfortable sort of valence, as it were, engaging. It's very hard to uncover and unmask a vulnerable narcissist because they will always try to use the most messy, convoluted, hysterical, emotionally charged subjects that they will often needlessly converge into the same subject, into the same issue at hand. And the job really is for you to delineate out those elements, those threads, and to deal with them in turn, essentially, and also perhaps to economically know how to know that you're not going to have the time to do that. So you have to find a way to sort of batch those threads to some extent and say, we can talk about that some other time when you're not confusing it with this other thing, and then that is the thing that then you deal with specifically then and there, uh, so that essentially you come out on top on that point. You don't try to sort of take on the whole thing. You have to sort of envisage exactly what you're capable of doing, let's say economically, with the time, with the kind of attention, with the kind of uh, um, accusation, you know, uh, to sort of focus on the stick of dynamite amongst you know, uh, uh, the other packaged bits of shrapnel and nails, because essentially those things do a lot of damage with the dynamite, but you have to sort of focus on diffusing the dynamite, as it were, um, and pointing at the other bits as being sort of um, secondary, and then very, obviously they won't have them easily. They won't let you, let's say, unconflate them. They won't let you disambiguate the issue. Um, so you have to cleverly find the tact of forcing them to disambiguate it, or to at least permit you in disambiguating it. And often the point of disambiguating it will require some kind of concession to their rhetoric, but it's a half concession, and it's done in order to get into their paradigm and to dismantle it and to collapse it. And this requires a certain level of rhetorical tact. It requires a certain level of intuitive sensitivity. You have to have a sensibility of the kind of um, intellectual dishonesty and how it is operating in terms of their emotional currency, as it were, yeah, and I mean, I say that these people are vulnerable narcissists. In some sense, it's an ideological construction of vulnerable narcissism, and so I mean, often it just comes off quite blithely as what I can only describe as bad faith. It's a patently and intellectually dishonest position. It's based on essentially shaming the other person into not replying, into not grappling with what they're saying, into sort of, because essentially that's why it devolves into you're not allowed to talk about that. You're not allowed to respond. You just have to accept the accusation. You just have to accept what is being said about you, how you are being maligned. And essentially, you lose by exiting the arena. You lose by essentially by ceding the ground, and that is what I see in the second paragraph of the anti-racist declaration. in this cult of political correctness, the argument has already been seeded when you just apply to join the DA. Um, which is, I mean, it's quite sad. I'll say that on my own behalf. I mean, perhaps, obviously, I'm not a member, so people will just, it doesn't, I guess I don't qualify to be a member, but, so I'm talking from the outside, but essentially, if people are held to that declaration, essentially, the organization is fundamentally lost because it has already conceded the political point needed that needs to be challenged. It's already ceded it to political correctness. And so if that is the caliber of what exists within the party, if that is representative of the intellectual milieu or whatever, then it's yeah. So I mean, anyway, I guess I'm going to. I think I've said all I can on this kind of topic. But yeah, if the DA can't get its act together, it might. I mean, I say these things as if I have the capacity to do it, which I don't. But I guess it's just going to be a slow motion train wreck until some kind of genocide or something. Um, I think people still. I mean, I'm. I mean, when I said, like, when I was talking about myself just now, I just mean I don't really have the capacity to leave the country. I'm pretty much yeah. Well, man, I guess it's also on some level it's somewhat fitting that I experience whatever the state of the nation devolves into, being a member of a society, of a failed society that was unable to defend its values.